to our second presentation today entitled Co-Manifold Learning, and will be delivered by Eric Chi from Rice University. So Eric, all yours.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the introduction. So I am an associate professor in the statistics department here at Rice. And today I'll be talking about a new way of doing dimensionality reduction on your data matrices. So this is joint work with my collaborators Gal Michne at UC San Diego and Rafi Koifman at Yale. Okay, so I want to start off first by talking about a simpler task, the biclustering problem. And so, this is going to set the stage for why you want to do something maybe a little bit more complicated with this kind of nonlinear dimensionality reduction co-manifold learning. Okay, so in the biclustering task, you have a data matrix, and you would like to identify column groupings or clusters, and simultaneously learn or discover row groupings or clusters. And this is a very common task, for example, in cancer genomics. We're seeing here a data matrix where the columns correspond to different tissue samples. These tissue samples were taken from different subtypes of lung cancer and some normal tissue. And so we see some ground truth labels encoded in color above the columns. And then also on the rows, we have different genes. And so each individual cell entry in this matrix has been color-coded to quantify the activity level of different genes in different tissue samples. And the goal in this context is you'd like to be able to discover or learn new cancer subtypes, and then simultaneously to identify sort of gene groups or features that are defining these subtypes. Okay, so we see in this particular motivating example that you do have a very nice, clean, discrete groupings of different tissue types, as well as some kind of discrete groupings of genes whose activity profiles are defining these different cancer subtypes. Okay, and there's lots of methods on these things. There's just a sampling of different references. And I just want to highlight particular one work with Ginevra Allen and Rich Berenik in Rice ECE, where we posed the problem of biclustering as a convex optimization problem. And I bring this up for a couple of reasons, but one is that this is going to be an algorithmic building block for the method that I'm going to talk about today. Okay, but what I want to explain next is how what's this relationship between biclustering and this co-manifold learning method I'm going to discuss. Okay, so during the review of this paper with Rich and Ginevra, one of the referees raised a really great point and really kind of motivates why we might want to extend biclustering to have a little bit more nuanced data. So this referee said, I would add in many real-world applications that there is no true fixed number of biclusters. The truth is a bit more continuous. And you totally agree with the referee. So what we see here in the lower left corner is another data matrix. This one's drawn from cheminformatics. So we have different compounds in the rows and different features of those compounds in the columns. And what we see is that there really is some nice structure to be discovered among the rows and also the columns. The columns exhibit a much stronger and discrete clustering structure. However, the rows, even though we see that there's some similarity patterns, they look like the pattern's the structure's not quite as continuous. Indeed, what we see is that if we re-represent the columns in a lower dimensional space or embedding on the far right, we can see a very clear clustering structure for the different features or columns. And if we also re-represent the rows in a new lower dimensional coordinate system or embedding, we see that indeed the compounds, there is a similar structure, but it lies kind of more on a continuum, just as the referee kind of points out. Okay, so the method we're going to talk about today is going to enable you to identify these lower dimensional coordinate systems so they can get a better look and a cleaner look at sort of identifying structure in your data matrices. Okay, so I don't have too much time to go over the details about why you want to do this, but I think a very natural question you would ask is, we have lots of methods for manifold learning for doing these kind of nonlinear dimensionality reductions. Why not just do that on the rows and the columns separately? And you can certainly do that. It's going to turn out to be a lot cheaper computationally to do that. However, if you do have structure simultaneously on the rows and the columns, there's a lot of information that you're leaving on the table if you don't account for that simultaneously. Try to find these structures in the row and the columns at the same time. Okay, so actually, this is a little bit builds off of kind of similar themes that Kristen gave in her talk about kind of this chicken egg problem. So if you have structure along the rows, you can use that information to help you find structure in the columns. If you have structure in the columns, you can use that information to find structure in the rows. Okay, so you certainly could do this in an alternating manner, but you could also do this in a kind of a simple one framework and do this all jointly. And when you do that, you do a better job identifying structure in the rows and the columns simultaneously. All right, so the procedure I'm going to tell you about today is 3 major steps. The first step is to blur or smooth your data matrices a different amount along the rows and the columns. Okay? And this is where we're going to build off of that method, convex biclustering, that we developed with Ginevra and Rich. Okay, and then once we have these smooth data matrices, we're going to construct what we call multiscale row metrics. And then multi-scale column metrics. So these are just distances between the pairs of rows and distances between the pairs of columns. And then once we have those row distances and column distances, we're going to use some standard nonlinear embedding techniques or dimensionality reduction techniques on the rows and the columns separately. Okay, so in this talk, we use diffusion maps, but there's a lot of alternatives, and you would get essentially the same answers by kind of swapping in your different choices. Okay, so in this talk, since the third step is somewhat standard, we're just going to focus on the new stuff in steps 1 and 2. Okay, so I tell things a little bit out of order, just so that to give you some intuition behind steps 1 and 2. Okay, so this is going to be how do we construct these multiscale metrics, and we'll focus first on how do we compute pairwise distances between rows. Okay, and again, the key assumption here is that there's structure along the columns and there's structure along the rows. Okay, so suppose in our data matrix there is some similar structure along the columns, and we've permuted the columns to respect that similar structure. Okay, so what that means practically is that after you do this permutation, each row is a smooth function over its indices. Okay, so I'm showing here are 2 different rows, the ith row in orange and the jth row in green, and we see visually that these 2 rows are kind of very slight perturbations or distortions of each other, small shifts from each other. Okay, so if we're going to construct a metric for these rows, and they live in very high dimensional space, naively, what we could do is we could just take the Euclidean distance between these 2. Okay, however, this distance metric is very bad in high dimensions. In this particular example, we see that even though these 2 rows are just very slight visual perturbations of each other, the Euclidean distance kind of misses the fact that the supports are just very close to each other, but they don't overlap. Okay, so if we take this kind of naive distance, it's kind of large. Okay, however, if we leverage the fact that there's a smoothness structure or ordering structure along the columns, and we've been fortuitous enough to be given this. Okay, what we could do is we can smooth the data. Okay, the rows along the columns, okay, and then take the distance. We see that after doing this, and we take the Euclidean distance, that slight perturbation gets smaller. Okay, so we've kind of in some ways kind of appropriately denoised the signal, and after denoising, we can take a distance and it gets smaller, and we can repeat this process. And we see that if we smooth the data appropriately enough, this discrepancy that really is kind of just a small perturbation, it goes away. So this gives the idea behind why we want to construct these multi-scale metrics. So the multi-scale part means that we're going to take our data and then smooth it different amounts. Okay, and so we're going to hedge a little bit. We're going to construct a distance metric that puts more weight on the more smooth or more denoised representations of the data. Okay, and then once we have a collection of these smooth copies, we'll take distances, okay, on all those, and then we'll take a weighted average or weighted sum over these. Okay? And you can do the exact same kind of thought experiment or exercise with another example where maybe you have 2 rows that are visually very distinct. Okay, and we'll see that it doesn't matter how much you smooth the data, they'll look different at different scales. Okay, and so you'll still preserve that kind of large distance. Okay. Okay, so the key assumption through all this is that we assume there's some structure along the columns that would help us identify structure along the rows. Okay, and we knew that. Okay, and of course we don't know that in practice. Okay, so what we really need is some simple data-driven way to automatically smooth both the rows and columns simultaneously over the right pairs of rows and columns. Okay, so this sounds like a little bit of a tall order, However, it turns out the convex biclustering method we worked on with Ginevra and Rich sort of actually is kind of the perfect tool for this. Okay. All right, so I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about the smoothing procedure and let's look at the case of how we might do clustering by solving a convex optimization problem. Suppose we have a data matrix where xi represents the ith row. And what we're going to do is assign to each row a parameter ui. You can kind of think of this as a smooth or denoised copy of xi. Okay. I have a data fidelity term in this optimization problem on the left. And then I have a roughness penalty or a cost or tax for if these centroids are different. Okay, so this prior belief is that not every data point is its own cluster center. Okay, I only have a couple of truly distinct clusters. Okay, so let's see what happens to build some intuition if I solve this optimization problem. Gamma is a trade-off parameter between how well my model UIs fit the data and how rough they are, how different they are. Okay, and you see as we increase gamma, I'm tracing out these UIs. There's a single UI for each data point. However, as gamma gets bigger, there's fewer and fewer distinct UIs. Okay, so at this level of gamma, there are only 3 distinct UIs. Okay. Eventually, all the UIs are exactly the same. Okay, so we see that by solving a sequence of these complex optimization problems, we are actually discovering or learning a hierarchical organization or multiscale representation of our data point cloud. Okay, so all we're going to do is apply this formulation for building these kind of multiscale representations on the rows and the columns of data matrix simultaneously. Just a kind of a slight modification on the optimization problem. And I'm just going to show this is a simple picture where I'm kind of smoothing the rows and the columns the same amount. Okay? And we can see we're generating this kind of multi-scale representation of the data matrix smoothed at different scales along the rows and the columns. Okay, and of course we can make this model a little more flexible by smoothing more aggressively the rows and the columns. Okay, see a little noisy disk here, and we're going to blur it along the rows, maybe more along the rows as we move down, and then more along the columns as we move left to right. Okay, so once we have this tool in our toolbox, what we're going to do is we have our data matrix. We're going to smear it or smooth it out along the rows and the columns different amounts. So this gamma L and gamma K are going to be controlling that. I have a smooth copy U that's indexed by how much I smoothed it with respect to the rows and the columns. Okay? And then once I have this big bag of smooth matrices, I'm going to take this hedged or weighted pairwise distances. So here I'm showing how to compute the pairwise distances between the ith and jth rows in my data matrix. Okay, so I take this weighted combination, and the gamma L's and gamma K's, they're encoding how aggressively I'd smooth the columns versus the rows. Okay. And then once you have these weighted different combinations, this multiscale row metric, you can apply your standard diffusion map to do this. You can do the exact same thing for the columns as well. Okay, so the last part of the talk, I just want to walk through a simple toy example to see to give some sense of how well this might work. We have 2 sets of point clouds, a Z point cloud and a Y point cloud. The data is going to consist of cross-set distances between points in the Z point cloud and points in the Y point cloud. I'm not going to have all the pairwise distances. Okay, so in this case, I have 50% missing data. And what I want to recover is the structure or the geometry of the Z point cloud and the Y point cloud from these pairwise distances of the pairwise cross-set distances. Okay, all right, so we'll just talk through the top example. So look at the first row. The Z point cloud is this little sheet, rainbow sheet, and the Y point cloud is this helix. And what we have here are 4 different methods. We have CoManifold Learning on the far right, and we see that the low-dimensional representations of this nonlinear PCA and CoManifold Learning, they seem to do the best. I do want to highlight this diffusion map to the left of the CoManifold Learning. What we did was we did diffusion maps just on the rows independently and on the columns. And you see that in this particular example, not leveraging the smoothness information along the rows and the columns simultaneously can lead to very poor lower dimensional representations. Okay? And we have another example at the bottom. You can look in the paper for further discussion on these things. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just wrap up and say, at this point, what we have is a procedure for finding low-dimensional representations on the rows and the columns to help your exploratory data analysis. Most of the results are pretty empirical right now, but if you look in the paper, there's some more details about some of the algorithmic guarantees. So with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I will stop now.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric, for the very nice presentation here. So once more, we're right on the mark here. So we'll defer
Okay.
maybe any questions
Sure.
either through Brela. You can contact Eric, or directly you can contact him through email or other means. Sure, he'll be happy to answer questions about this very cool topic.
Okay. Thank
And
you.
and thanks, Eric, once more. And that brings us